The Skaven of Warhammer Fantasy, being a species of maniacal bipedal rats, might actually be a metaphor for the strain and destruction caused by the Industrial Revolution. Hello, J-Bad acolytes. Today we're talking about the funny rat people and my crackpot theory about how they might actually have significance. Trust me, I'm on to something here, I promise. The script for this video is the slightly modified version of an essay I wrote for a university class, which I hope you find as amusing as I do. Anyway, I dug through all sorts of 40-year-old Citadel journals, source books, and all sorts of other things to put this together, and I decided, screw it, why not make this into a video? But as a disclaimer, I acknowledge that Warhammer Fantasy lore is massive and somewhat decentralized between novels, army books, tabletop RPG source books, and so on. So I've probably missed something somewhere, and as said, this is a crackpot theory. Anyway, without further ado, here's how the funny warpstone-snorting rodents are actually a surprisingly cogent metaphor. This whole concept starts with our acknowledgement of the Skaven's advanced technology and the havoc and suffering the use of it causes themselves and others. It's kind of their whole thing. But given the lack of common knowledge people have about the Skaven and tabletop wargames generally, we'll lay a little bit of groundwork for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about. So, Warhammer Fantasy is a massive universe and one that came around about 40 years ago as the mainline franchise, at first, of Games Workshop, a UK-based tabletop gaming company. Warhammer Fantasy originally was a tabletop wargame created by Brian Ansell, Richard Hallowell, and Rick Priestley. If you aren't aware, a tabletop wargame is a sort of complex board game in which one collects the different models, think game pieces, puts them together, paints them, and then uses them in the operation of the game. Sounds miserable, but it's actually fun. Rick Priestley defines such games in his guide to their creation, Tabletop Wargames, a designer's and writer's handbook, as a game where opposing armies of models clash over a tabletop laid out with model terrain to create the impression of a battlefield. Such games are generally much larger in scale than any actual board game, ranging from an average game piece count of around 20, going up as high as nearly 200 with both sides combined. Each side competes in a simulated battle, though the level of realism or seriousness of the rule set varies wildly. Such games are not super well understood by the general public, and Priestley summarizes this idea by saying, "The uninitiated often picture a wargame only in terms of recreating great battles of history with model soldiers. In reality, it is only occasionally that wargamers will get together and attempt anything so ambitious as a refight of an actual historic battle, using realistic terrain and armies that accurately portray those present on the day. Simply building and then storing a scale model of a battlefield is a major undertaking and one that is beyond most of us. In any case, many gamers prefer to fight battles based on popular fantasy or science fiction franchises or other purely fictitious settings." Warhammer Fantasy, being one of those purely fictitious settings, needed different factions to populate its fantasy world so that different ranges of models could be created by Games Workshop to then be sold, painted, and played with by the players. From this introduction, one might imagine such factions would be essentially superfluous, either existing only as cosmetic designs with no real narrative intent, or at best, poorly aping Tolkien as many fantasies do. Warhammer still apes Tolkien, don't get me wrong, but I think they typically do a pretty good job at it, at least. Instead, the writers at Games Workshop decided to do something different, to create a world and then over time flesh it out in really quite incredible detail. A modern new mythology, in a sense. This new mythology is steeped in symbolism and metaphors and history, both timeless and grounded in the 1980s UK that they were created in a way that only now is beginning to receive credit as the Warhammer IP has slowly begun to slip into the mainstream ever so gradually. Secret Level, a series of animated shorts on Amazon Prime, recently featured an episode about Warhammer 40,000, the space fantasy, not sci-fi as one might assume, alternative to Warhammer Fantasy. This Secret Level episode has been one of many things bringing the Warhammer franchise into the public consciousness, and thankfully it was a pretty good episode. As it exists now and has existed, Warhammer has been an IP with a rabidly dedicated fan base, generally spoilt for new content. The Black Library, the publishing arm of Games Workshop, has published hundreds of full-length novels detailing the adventures of characters from these universes. The most beloved of those for Warhammer Fantasy would be the Gotrek and Felix series, of course. But all of this has been said to introduce not only the concept of tabletop wargaming, but the idea that despite managing to avoid significant popular or critical scrutiny, the Warhammer IP has been creating stories and mythologies of fair quality for going on 4 decades. There are many things within the IP that I could make videos about. Many people make their whole channels about Warhammer, but the Skaven are perhaps one of the most interesting things within it that we could talk about, so that's why this random video exists. Warhammer Fantasy as a universe is a very distinct place to me in the fantasy zeitgeist. I mean, it borrows from Tolkien, mostly in cosmetic ways, with dwarves and elves and so on, but their presentation and their purposes within the world are pretty different and, at the very least, significantly modified from what you might see in other universes. And that's just because Warhammer Fantasy is a world of decay and corruption and great mortal danger. Compared to most contemporary fantasy, it is much more related to the feeling of the Brothers Grimm than King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, unless we're talking about Bretonnia. It is in this respect we begin to approach addressing the primary concern: what the Skaven mean in a narrative sense. The humans of Warhammer Fantasy, at least their main faction, the Empire, don't rely on conventional medieval fantasy tropes. Old, friendly wizards are not the wielders of magic, but those brave or foolish enough to risk tampering with powers as capable of saving lives as summoning demons. They are not limited to bows and crossbows, nor trebuchets and catapults. Instead, they wield cannons, muskets, and steampunk mechanical constructs in equal numbers. In essence, Warhammer Fantasy isn't medieval fantasy, it's Renaissance fantasy. This kind of setting impacts the factions of the world fairly differently. The Elven factions ignore technology, relying on their superior magic to maintain their falling empire. And that is another theme. Almost everyone is in decay, and the reason for that will become evident sort of quickly. The dwarves and the humans, staunch allies within the setting, are both on the very cusp of the Industrial Revolution. The dwarves got there first, but are hamstrung by their extremely traditionalist leaders. Long-lived as they are, it might take a century for something as simple as a new pulley system to be accepted as well-tested enough and adopted, much less actual new mechanisms or weapons. I'm exaggerating a little, but you get the idea. They're very slow to change. The humans, meanwhile, have been playing catch-up, so to speak, but at the modern day of the setting, they're almost neck and neck with the dwarves for being the most technologically advanced in the setting, and they aren't limited nearly so much by traditionalism. They're at the very, very cusp of assembly lines, factories, coal power, all that sort of thing. Wonder if that reminds you of anything from history. But they aren't actually the most advanced faction in the setting. That title goes to the funny Ratmen lurking underneath their cities, concealed from your average person by the powers that be, for if they knew the truth, they'd likely go mad. With all of this build-up, the Skaven can finally be directly addressed. The Skaven are a group of ontologically evil bipedal rats wielding incredibly powerful, if unreliable, technology, whose only goal is to consume the world and cleanse it of all non-Skaven. There is no moral nuance to the individual Skaven. As a good resource on Skaven, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, Children of the Horned Rat says, the Skaven are creatures of pure ego and selfishness, motivated only by the fear of those above them in rank. They have little consideration for anything beyond these goals. No honor, no courage, no sense of decency or justice, and absolutely no ethics. With such a description, one might imagine that there wouldn't be much of anything interesting to discuss surrounding the Skaven at all, that they would be an enjoyable antagonistic faction for the setting and not a whole lot else. Instead, the hints towards the true meaning of the Skaven can be found even at their very inception, with the spring 1986 copy of the Citadel Journal, also written by Rick Priestley alongside Jess Goodwin, where they discuss the special substance the Skaven use for their advanced contraptions, warpstone. It states, refined warpstone is powdery and gray, quite unlike the original matter. This is a very subtle hint, but an important one. Also, hold on, I know those of you who know about the Skaven are screaming at me, but warpstone is a green crystal. Just give me a second. Anyway, a gray powdery substance may just be something one would find reminiscent of gunpowder. The thing here that's interesting, though in all likelihood this little part of it is reading way too far into it, is that one might confuse gunpowder with black powder and assume they're the same, and the humans already have black powder, but they're not the same. Gunpowder is post-industrial and more powerful, so maybe there's something to that, but probably not. But the significance here is that the thing that sets Skaven apart even from the beginning was basically gunpowder. Anyway, the Skaven in their industry represent the horrors and dangers unleashed upon humanity as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the carelessness for human life that caused various tragedies and abuses and such as a result. A lot of this can be seen in the expansions for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which throughout its editions is basically just a D&D style game but for this universe. And an example of that is shown when these books describe their weaponry, where they say, other species would consider such weapons far too dangerous for large-scale use on the battlefield, but Skaven have a different attitude, accepting a few losses from their own weapons as normal. We can also further this connection to humanity in the real world by the way in which the Old Citadel Journal defines the Skaven's appearance, describing them first and foremost as such. Skaven take the form of giant rats twisted into a parody of human shape. It is evident in the way they are described that they are meant to evoke comparisons to humanity with the word parody. And I mean, they are often colloquially referred to as Ratmen. Even other humanoid villainous factions like the orcs or goblins are not described this way. They're not made to be like people the way Skaven are, even though you could argue Skaven look further removed. Anyway, once all of this sort of concept gets said out loud, I think it becomes almost obvious. One of the primary appeals to fantasy settings is that they are a step away from our modern world and a return to a sort of mythical time when things were simpler and there was, for lack of a better word, magic remaining within the world. Thus, in the 80s UK, a new fantasy setting with a grim twist being written in Thatcherite England might well make a comment about these feelings. I mean, Tolkien himself wrote Lord of the Rings partially inspired by that mythological return to a world before the World War I that he himself experienced. Thus, the protagonistic forces are drifting towards the Industrial Revolution, one in context knows may be disastrous, as their foes, the Skaven, exist to demonstrate that point. And since we were talking about deterioration earlier, all of the other factions are deteriorating in fairly obvious ways, whereas with the Empire, their main problem is that their empire is corrupt and constantly threatened, but they aren't decaying, but they are decaying or heading towards it because they're on the cusp of this Industrial Revolution that will make them be like the Skaven. It is at this point that delving into the specifics of the Skaven becomes more relevant, that the degree to which this metaphor has been established may be made more clear and is visible in most products that contain the Skaven. Two video games, Warhammer Vermintide 2 and the Total War Warhammer series, have brought the Skaven into the limelight and closer to gaining public recognition than ever before. Those were the games that introduced me to this universe in the Skaven, and I imagine there are a fair amount of you for whom that is also the case. Anyway, Vermintide has sold at least 10 million copies. The Warhammer games have sold probably about as well, though I don't have exact numbers on that. But both of them have become mainstream opportunities to display the Skaven in a popular, interactive, and most importantly, visual media, and have succeeded in different ways. They also demonstrate the founding concepts behind the Skaven separately, but effectively in equal measure. So if you haven't heard of it, Vermintide is a first-person cooperative game considered part of the hack and slash or horde slasher slash shooter subgenre of video games, that was very hard to say, in which between 1 to 4 players, each acting as one of the game's cast of characters, fights their way through levels, battling hordes of hundreds of Skaven amongst other enemies. Despite the kind of frivolous seeming nature of such a game, it's pretty well written, especially in terms of the dialogue of the characters.
You fall a great deal for one so nimble, elf.
Can I help it if they find me a challenge?
Challenge? By Sigmar, a challenge indeed. Every minute, every second.
In this game, the Skaven are a nigh unstoppable, world-ending force, best seen in the trailer for both the first and the second Vermintide games. Here, they are a source of horror, something that lurks beneath the cities of the world, waiting to rise up and destroy everything. It's even an idea present in the idle dialogue of the game. One of the playable characters, Marcus Kruber, says the following, and I'm going to do bad impressions of them too. Funny, I don't think of the Ratmen as being siege canny. A knife in the back or a bowels is more their way. And another, Victor Saltspire, a character famous for particularly hating the Skaven and having this voice, says, "Then you misjudge them, Kruber. The Ratmen are fearsome in sieges, most often clawing their way in from below." In Vermintide, the Skaven might represent the connection to the Industrial Revolution through terror. They are a world-ending force which, while still within the context of the abyss known as the End Times, can be taken, in this case, as an extension of the metaphor. In ending the world, they are fairly obviously responsible for an event that will darken the world in a great many ways. The status quo the Skaven will create in their victory will involve pittance wages or outright slavery, or because it's the end times, the world exploding, but, terrible working conditions and the production of weapons so destructive that millions may be killed by industrial warfare. The nature surrounding the battlefields utterly devastated. These are all ideas the Skaven represent in this avenue. I feel like half insane explaining this, but you've got to see the connection between Warhammer Fantasy, Tolkien, and then ultimately the World War I trench hell aesthetic that the Skaven kind of create. Then this is furthered by their portrayal in the Total War Warhammer games. It is most obvious in a trailer for the Prophet and the Warlock expansion to the game, which added a Skaven character named Ikit. More than any other character from the Skaven faction, Ikit is the epitome of this industrial connection. He is the mastermind behind most of the Skaven's most destructive weaponry, including something called the Doom Rocket, meant rather unsubtly to be comparable to a nuclear weapon, which is where I can say that modern warpstone being a green crystal is meant to now be more of a metaphor for like uranium and radioactivity and that sort of thing, and MAD and WMDs and all that. Within the context of Total War Warhammer, the Skaven are less of a source of horror, as playing as the mechanical rats turns that horror into comedy as you disintegrate your enemies with all sorts of ramshackle creations. That, alongside them being but one of dozens of competing empires on roughly even footing with the others, rather than the world-ending threat seen in Vermintide. Even so, Ikit faction, Clan Scryer, is known to be the most powerful of the various competing powers within Skaven society, as according to the WFRP Horned Rat Companion, by selling the services of their specialized weapon teams to the constantly warring clans, the masters of Clan Scryer have achieved an unparalleled level of influence and are, at the moment, the most prominent of the four greater clans. With such a statement as this, one could even extrapolate out the themes explored by the Skaven to apply to more modern things, including the proliferation of arms across the world during and after the Cold War, or, as seen in the Prophet and the Warlock trailer, an allusion to the destruction of the natural environment caused by these sorts of weapons. Or, as said earlier, nuclear weapons. But hey, there's no mad doctrine if you're the only one with the nukes. That, too, though, is also a common theme amongst the Skaven. They are almost anti-nature to the extreme, turning any natural environment they are surrounded by into a stinking mire of mud and machinery, the second most obvious visual indicator connecting their industrialism with their destructiveness. This could even be why one of Warhammer Fantasy's factions, the Wood Elves, hate the Skaven in particular. For the Wood Elves, as one might expect, venerate nature in a way incomprehensible to the Skaven. Given the Wood Elves are often portrayed as protagonistic or at least neutral, there is a definite, clear point being made by the writers of Warhammer on that dichotomy. So, the Skaven are a genius creation of the Warhammer franchise, even if all of this schizophrenic rambling doesn't mean anything to you at all. They're still greatly well designed, and though their destructive antics are often played for laughs, and this is often how people come to enjoy them, they have serious and meaningful roots in making a comment on the things humanity lost over the last centuries, and the pains humanity and the Earth itself have suffered as a result of the mass industrialization that continues to this day. While they may be easily written off as not having any deeper meanings, and not without reason, the Skaven send a resonant message to those who embrace fantasy for the reasons the creators of Warhammer seem to have done. An appreciation for the magic of the natural world that once was. It was not perfect, it was not safe, nor always kind, yet it was also never so callous as that which followed. So, that's what I think about the good old Skaven. Am I onto something? Do I need to go to the padded room? I'm not so sure, but let me know if you want anything this unhinged ever again, and tell me what your thoughts about this are in the comments. If you've enjoyed this or want to see any more of my madness, each like and subscription goes a very long way to helping the channel along. We also have a Discord if you want to have a place to discourage me from further stupid video ideas, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want that, where said bad video ideas are released a week early. I'd also like to thank a few of our crazy patrons, however, those being Knights of the Inner Circle, Shadowrunner, and Sawnee, Knight Nico, and our loyal Squire Greer. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, if experiencing symptoms of existential dread from the endless news cycle, go outside. If no greenery and set outside is present, go until you find greenery and then touch it.